The morning of May 17th, 1943, dawned cool and overcast at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Inside a reinforced concrete observation bunker, a group of American ordnance officers stood in silence, their breath visible in the early spring chill. Before them, resting on a raised earthen berm 300 yards distant, sat what many considered the most fearsome weapon of the European war, a German Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger tank, captured intact just weeks earlier in Tunisia. The tank was magnificent and terrible. Even motionless, stripped of its crew and fuel, the Tiger radiated menace. Its angular hull rose nearly 10 feet from track to turret roof. The 88-millimeter gun barrel extended like an accusing finger toward the American observers. Every surface was scarred with the patina of combat, dents from ricochets, scrapes from close calls, the faded remnants of German tactical markings. This was no museum piece. This was a killer, responsible for destroying dozens of Allied tanks before a lucky shot to its tracks had immobilized it near Medjez El Bab. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Colonel James Thompson, chief of the Ballistic Research Laboratory's Armor Section, raised his binoculars. Behind him, technicians made final adjustments to a 90-millimeter M3 anti-aircraft gun, hastily mounted on a fixed test stand. The weapon had been chosen for a specific reason. Rumors from the field suggested that America's standard tank guns, the 75-millimeter and even the newer 76-millimeter, were struggling against German heavy armor. The 90-millimeter represented America's next generation of tank armament, already earmarked for the new M36 tank destroyer then in development. But could it actually defeat a Tiger? The question mattered desperately. In North Africa, American tank crews had encountered Tigers for the first time, and the results had been psychologically devastating. Sherman tank commanders reported pumping round after round into Tigers at close range, 500 yards, 300 yards, sometimes even closer, and watching their armor-piercing shot bounce harmlessly off the German armor. Meanwhile, the Tiger's 88 could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor from well over a mile away. The mathematics of this exchange were brutal and demoralizing. American tankers had begun to speak of the Tiger in hushed, almost superstitious tones, as if it were not merely superior engineering but something approaching invincibility. This belief did not emerge from nowhere. German propaganda had worked tirelessly to cultivate the Tiger's mystique, and battlefield results seemed to confirm every claim. When the first Tigers appeared on the Eastern Front in late 1942 near Leningrad, they had torn through Soviet defenses with shocking ease. A single Tiger, properly positioned and commanded, could hold an entire road junction against a Soviet tank brigade. The Soviet 76-millimeter gun, which had been more than adequate against Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs, proved almost useless against Tiger frontal armor, except at suicidally close ranges. The Western Allies had encountered similar frustrations. British tank crews in Tunisia discovered that even their 17-pounder anti-tank guns, among the most powerful in the Allied arsenal, struggled to guarantee penetration against Tiger frontal armor beyond 1,000 yards. The American 75-millimeter M3 gun, standard armament on the Sherman tank, was simply outclassed. Official U.S. Army testing had determined that the Sherman's gun could not penetrate a Tiger's front plate at any practical combat range. To achieve a side penetration against the Tiger's 80-millimeter upper hull superstructure, a Sherman needed to close to within 300 feet, a range at which the Tiger would have already destroyed multiple Shermans. The psychological weight of this disparity cannot be overstated. Tank warfare has always been as much about morale and tactical confidence as raw specifications. When crews believe their weapons are inadequate, they fight defensively, hesitate at critical moments, and lose the initiative that mobile warfare demands. By spring of 1943, American tank doctrine was being rewritten around a single grim principle: Avoid Tigers. If encountered, call for air support, artillery or tank destroyers. Do not engage frontally. Do not close the distance. Survive. But the 90mm gun represented a different proposition entirely. Developed initially as an anti-aircraft weapon, the M3 variant fired a 24-pound projectile at a muzzle velocity of 2,650 feet per second. This gave it substantially more kinetic energy than the 75mm or 76mm guns then in American service. The question Aberdeen sought to answer was not whether the 90mm could damage a Tiger. Preliminary calculations suggested it could. But at what range penetration became reliable? The Tiger itself embodied a specific design philosophy that had emerged from German experiences on the Eastern Front. When Wehrmacht units first encountered Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks in summer of 1941, they had been genuinely shocked. German 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns often proved inadequate against these well-armored Soviet designs. The standard Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks of 1941 could be penetrated by Soviet guns at ranges where German return fire was ineffective. Hitler himself had demanded development of a heavy breakthrough tank that could dominate any battlefield through sheer superiority of armor and armament. The result was the Tiger. Its frontal hull armor measured 100mm thick, nearly 4 inches of hardened steel plate. The frontal turret matched this thickness, while the gun mantlet varied between 120 and 200mm, depending on the specific production variant. The sides were 80mm thick on the upper hull and 60mm on the lower hull. This was armor that, in 1942 and early 1943, no standard Allied tank gun could reliably penetrate from the front at combat ranges. The Tiger's 88mm KWK-36 L56 gun only amplified its advantages. This weapon, derived from Germany's famous 88mm anti-aircraft gun, could penetrate roughly 100mm of armor at 1,000 meters when firing armor-piercing rounds. Against the Sherman's frontal armor, approximately 50mm effective thickness after accounting for slope, the Tiger could achieve kills at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. In practical terms, a Tiger could destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before they closed to a range where their own guns became marginally effective. German training manuals emphasized exploiting this advantage. Tiger commanders were instructed to engage at maximum range, using their superior optics and gun to eliminate targets before Allied tanks could respond effectively. The tactic worked devastatingly well in North Africa's open terrain, where sight lines extended for miles and clever positioning allowed a single Tiger to control vast areas. American after-action reports from Tunisia documented instances where Tigers destroyed 10, 15, even 20 Allied tanks while receiving multiple hits that failed to penetrate their armor. The captured Tiger at Aberdeen represented an intelligence windfall. Previous examinations had relied on studying knocked-out Tigers in the field, where combat damage made systematic analysis difficult. This specimen, though, was intact. American engineers had already spent weeks measuring every dimension, testing every mechanism, documenting every aspect of its construction. They had discovered surprising facts. The Tiger's armor, while thick, was not especially hard. It achieved protection through mass rather than advanced metallurgy. The transmission, though robust, was complex and prone to failure under field conditions. The interleaved road wheel suspension, while providing excellent cross-country performance, collected mud and debris that could freeze solid in cold weather, immobilizing the tank. But none of these weaknesses mattered if Allied guns could not penetrate the armor in the first place. And so Aberdeen had arrived at this moment, a controlled test to determine, with scientific precision, whether America's most powerful tank gun could defeat Germany's most feared tank. The test protocol was straightforward. The 90mm gun would fire at the Tiger's frontal armor from varying ranges, beginning at close distance and progressively moving back. Different ammunition types would be tested. Standard M82 armor-piercing capped shot, which used a steel penetrator with explosive filler, and the newer T-33 shot, which featured improved heat treatment for better penetration characteristics. If time and ammunition permitted, they would also test the experimental HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing rounds that used a tungsten carbide subcaliber penetrator to achieve dramatically higher velocities. The first shot rang out at precisely 9:15 that morning, the sharp crack of the 90-millimeter gun echoing across the Aberdeen range. From 300 yards, a range considered nearly suicidal in actual combat, the M82 armor-piercing round struck the Tiger's frontal hull plate just left of center. The impact was visible even without binoculars. A bright flash, a shower of sparks, and then silence. The observers waited. Smoke drifted across the range. When it cleared, they could see the result. A clean penetration. The 24-pound projectile had punched completely through the Tiger's 100-millimeter frontal armor, the hole roughly 3.5 inches in diameter, with characteristic pedaling around the entry point where the armor had failed catastrophically. Inside the tank, the round would have continued its deadly path, destroying equipment, igniting ammunition, killing crew. Colonel Thompson lowered his binoculars slowly. Around him, other officers began checking their notes, verifying measurements, confirming what they had just witnessed. At 300 yards, a range where dozens of Sherman crews had died trying to close with Tigers, the 90-millimeter gun had achieved what American tankers had been told was nearly impossible. It had defeated the Tiger frontally. But 300 yards was only the beginning. The test protocol called for systematic evaluation at increasing ranges. If the 90-millimeter could penetrate at close range, that was merely interesting. What mattered for doctrine, for tactics, for the confidence of American tank crews was penetration at combat ranges. 1,000 yards, 1,500 yards, the distances where tank battles actually occurred in North Africa and would occur in the coming invasion of Europe. The gun crew reloaded. The next shot would be fired from 600 yards, then 900, then 1,200. Each shot represented not just a ballistic data point, but a potential answer to the question that had haunted Allied tank crews for months. Could America build a weapon that would allow its tankers to meet Tigers on something approaching equal terms? The second shot, fired from 600 yards, produced similar results. Clean penetration, complete failure of the Tiger's frontal armor. The third shot from 900 yards penetrated as well, though the impact point was slightly higher, striking closer to where the glacis plate met the main hull front. The fourth shot was scheduled for 1,200 yards, so it's half a mile, a range at which most tank engagements occurred in practice. At 1,200 yards, the geometry of tank warfare changed. At this distance, even minor variations in aim point could mean the difference between a killing blow and a harmless ricochet. Range estimation became critical. The natural dispersion of the gun, the unavoidable variance in where successive shots landed, meant that even with perfect aim, not every shot would strike the intended point. This was where the Tiger's armor had proven most effective in combat. At long range, Allied guns often struck at oblique angles, increasing effective armor thickness and promoting ricochets. The Tiger's relatively flat armor, paradoxically, was less vulnerable to this effect than more heavily sloped designs, but it still provided measurable protection. The 1,200-yard shot struck low, hitting the lower front plate. The impact was different this time, a deeper, more resonant sound, followed by a visible buckling of the armor plate. When the inspection team approached after the range was cleared, they found the round had penetrated, but barely. The projectile had passed through the armor but had begun to tumble, losing energy. Inside the tank, it would likely have still been catastrophic. The crew compartment of a Tiger was cramped, and a tumbling projectile ricocheting through the interior would have killed or wounded everyone present. But it was a marginal penetration, not the clean, decisive punching through seen at closer ranges. The engineers made careful notes. 1,200 yards with standard M82 ammunition represented something close to the maximum reliable penetration range against Tiger frontal armor. Beyond this distance, factors like shot angle, armor quality variance, and projectile performance would begin to make penetration inconsistent. For American tank destroyer crews, this translated to clear tactical guidance. Engage Tigers at 1,000 to 1,200 yards or closer with standard ammunition. At longer ranges, maneuver for better angles or wait for clearer shots. But the tests were far from over. The M82 round represented current production ammunition, the shot that would be available to American tank destroyer battalions in Europe within months. The T-33 round, with its improved heat treatment and harder penetrator, was newer. And the HVAP round, still experimental, still limited in production, represented the cutting edge of American armor-piercing technology. The T-33 tests began after a brief pause for lunch. The improved ammunition showed measurably better performance. At 1,200 yards, the T-33 achieved cleaner penetrations than the M82, with less deformation of the projectile and more consistent perforation of the armor plate. At 1,500 yards, the T-33 still managed penetrations, though these were again marginal. The practical combat range had extended by perhaps 200 to 300 yards, significant, but not revolutionary. Then came the HVAP rounds. Here the physics changed entirely. The HVAP shot used a tungsten carbide core wrapped in a light aluminum sabot. Upon firing, the sabot fell away, and the dense tungsten core continued downrange at velocities approaching 3,350 feet per second, nearly 700 feet per second faster than standard ammunition. This dramatic increase in velocity translated directly to penetration. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared, meaning that the velocity increase more than compensated for the HVAP core's lighter weight. The first HVAP shot fired at 1,500 yards produced a penetration so clean and complete that Colonel Thompson actually laughed, a short, startled bark of surprise. The tungsten penetrator had passed through the Tiger's frontal armor as if it were ordinary structural steel rather than hardened tank plate. The hole was smaller than those produced by the full-caliber M82 rounds, but the penetration was absolute, undeniable. Subsequent HVAP tests extended the range progressively. 1,800 yards, penetration. 2,000 yards, penetration. 2,200 yards, still achieving penetrations, though with increasing inconsistency. The final HVAP test shot for me fired at 2,400 yards, nearly 1.5 miles, struck the Tiger's turret front and penetrated partially, creating a deep crater but not fully perforating the armor. The implications were staggering. With HVAP ammunition, the 90-millimeter gun could engage and defeat Tigers at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. This was beyond the maximum effective range of most tank guns in service, Allied or German. It meant that American tank destroyers equipped with 90-millimeter guns and HVAP ammunition could theoretically engage Tigers before the Tigers could effectively return fire. The tables had turned. But there was a complication, one that would prove crucial in the coming campaigns. HVAP ammunition required tungsten carbide, a strategic material also needed for machine tools, armor-piercing ammunition for aircraft cannon, and numerous other military applications. Production was limited. By summer of 1944, when M36 tank destroyers began reaching frontline units in Europe, HVAP rounds were so scarce that many tank destroyer crews had never even fired one in training. Battalion commanders hoarded HVAP like gold, issuing it only for critical engagements. Tank destroyer crews learned to carry perhaps 5 or 10 HVAP rounds among their 47-round ammunition load, saving them for moments when nothing else would suffice. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Still, the knowledge that such ammunition existed, that American industry could produce rounds capable of defeating tigers at extended ranges, provided psychological reassurance even when the physical ammunition was unavailable. Crews knew they were not fighting with intrinsically inferior weapons. They were fighting with weapons that, given proper ammunition and favorable conditions, could match or exceed German heavy tank guns. The Aberdeen tests also revealed something subtler but equally important. The Tiger's armor, while thick, was not magically invulnerable. It was steel plate, manufactured to specific standards, possessing measurable properties that could be overcome with sufficient kinetic energy. The mythology that had grown around the Tiger, the whispered stories of invincibility, the near superstitious dread, began to crack under the weight of empirical data. American ordnance officers compiled the test results into a comprehensive report distributed to tank destroyer battalions and armored divisions. The report included photographs of the tested Tiger, showing entry and exit holes, diagrams indicating vulnerable zones at various ranges, and specific tactical recommendations. Crews were instructed that the 90mm gun could reliably penetrate Tiger frontal armor at 1,000 yards with standard ammunition. They were told that the Tiger's sides and rear were vulnerable to the 76mm gun at reasonable ranges. They learned that the Tiger's track system, complex and maintenance-intensive, could be disabled with high explosive rounds, immobilizing the tank and allowing follow-up attacks from better angles. Perhaps most importantly, the report emphasized that Tigers were rare. German industry had produced fewer than 1,500 Tigers by the war's end, compared to tens of thousands of Shermans, thousands of T-34s, and substantial numbers of other Allied tank types. The probability of encountering a Tiger remained relatively low. When Tigers did appear, they were devastating, but they were not numerous enough to dominate every engagement. The M36 tank destroyer, mounting the 90mm gun in an open-topped turret on a modified Sherman chassis, entered production in spring of 1944. By September, the first M36 battalions were arriving in Europe. During the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, M36s engaged Tigers and King Tigers with mixed but encouraging results. Some M36s were destroyed, certainly. The King Tiger's 185mm frontal turret armor and 150mm frontal hull armor proved resistant even to HVAP at many ranges. But M36s also achieved kills, including several confirmed Tiger destructions at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The 90mm gun also equipped the M26 Pershing heavy tank, which arrived in Europe in very limited numbers during the final months of the war. The Pershing represented America's answer to German heavy tanks, a vehicle with heavy frontal armor, good mobility, and the 90mm gun as standard armament. Only a few dozen Pershings reached Europe before VE Day, but their presence demonstrated that American tank design had evolved beyond the Sherman's limitations. The classified report from Aberdeen Proving Ground reached European theater headquarters in June of 1943, just as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Sicily. For the officers planning armored operations, the timing could hardly have been better. The North African campaign had concluded with Allied victory, but the psychological scars from encounters with Tigers remained fresh. Now, at least, American commanders possessed concrete data about how to counter the German heavy tanks. The report's circulation was carefully controlled. Copies went to armored division commanders, tank destroyer battalion commanders, and senior ordnance officers. The information could not be allowed to reach German intelligence. If the Germans learned that American testing had revealed specific vulnerabilities in Tiger armor, they might modify production standards or develop countermeasures. The tests themselves were classified as secret, and the results were distributed on a strict need-to-know basis. But information has a way of filtering downward, especially information that might keep men alive. By autumn of 1943, American tank destroyer crews were receiving informal briefings about the 90mm gun's capabilities. Officers who had read the Aberdeen report passed along its essential conclusions. The 90mm could kill Tigers frontally at 1,000 yards, possibly further with HVAP. The sides were vulnerable at longer ranges. The Tiger was dangerous but not invincible. This knowledge mattered enormously for morale. Tank warfare is intimate and terrifying in ways that infantry combat rarely matches. A tank crew fights inside a steel box filled with ammunition and fuel, knowing that a single penetrating hit can turn their vehicle into a crematorium in seconds. The men who crew tanks must possess either courage or fatalism, often both, to button up their hatches and drive toward enemy guns. When crews believe their weapons are inadequate, this psychological burden becomes nearly unbearable. The introduction of the M36 tank destroyer changed the equation. The first M36 battalion to arrive in Europe was the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, which received its vehicles in September of 1944 during the grinding battles in France. The battalion's after-action reports from October and November documented numerous engagements with German armor, including several confirmed encounters with Tigers. On November 4, 1944, near the German town of Pufendorf, an M36 from the 703rd Battalion engaged a Tiger at approximately 1,400 yards. The American crew had spotted the Tiger in a hull-down position, only its turret visible above a low rise. The M36's gunner, following doctrine learned from the Aberdeen tests, aimed for the Tiger's turret front. The first shot, standard M82 ammunition, struck low and ricocheted. The second shot hit squarely, penetrating the turret front plate. The Tiger's crew abandoned the vehicle seconds later, smoke pouring from the turret hatches. This engagement, documented in official records with photographs of the knocked-out Tiger, represented vindication of the Aberdeen tests' predictions. At 1,400 yards, a range where American 75mm guns would have been completely ineffective, the 90mm had achieved a frontal kill. The M36 crew had not needed to maneuver for flank shots or call for air support. They had engaged head-on and won. Similar engagements occurred throughout the autumn and winter of 1944. During the Battle of the Bulge, M36 battalions played crucial roles in stopping German armored spearheads. The 610th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M36s, engaged Tigers and King Tigers from the 6th SS Panzer Army near the town of Stavelot. Despite taking heavy casualties, the M36's open-topped turret made crews vulnerable to artillery and small arms fire. The battalion destroyed multiple German heavy tanks and helped contain the German advance. The psychological dynamic had shifted. American tank destroyer crews no longer felt they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. They possessed a weapon that, while not superior to the German heavy tank guns, was at least competitive. The German advantage in armor protection remained, certainly. A Tiger could survive hits that would destroy an M36, but the Americans had closed the capability gap substantially. German tankers noticed the change. Interrogation reports from captured Tiger crews in late 1944 and early 1945 reveal a growing awareness that American guns had improved. One Tiger commander, captured near the Rhine in March of 1945, stated that his crew had learned to treat M36 tank destroyers with the same respect they had previously reserved only for Soviet 85mm and 122mm guns. The long 90mm barrel, he explained, was distinctive and unmistakable. When Tiger commanders spotted an M36, they no longer assumed they could engage with impunity at long range. This represented a profound psychological reversal. For more than 2 years, Tiger crews had enjoyed what amounted to technical invincibility against most Allied tank guns. They had learned to press advantages aggressively, knowing that Allied tanks would need to close to near point-blank range to threaten penetration. The arrival of guns that could penetrate Tiger armor at 1,000 yards or beyond forced German crews to fight more cautiously, to seek better cover, to avoid exposing themselves unnecessarily. The Predator had learned it could be prey. The Aberdeen tests had also influenced American tank design in ways that would not become apparent until after the war. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, mounting the 90mm gun in a fully enclosed turret with heavy frontal armor, represented American acceptance that tank versus tank combat required vehicles specifically designed for that role. The Sherman, conceived primarily as an infantry support tank with secondary anti-tank capabilities, had proven inadequate against German heavy armor. The Pershing, though it arrived too late to affect the war's outcome significantly, established design principles that would influence American tanks for decades. Only 200 Pershings reached Europe before VE Day, and most saw limited combat. But their presence demonstrated that American industry could produce heavy tanks when doctrine demanded them. The post-war M46, M47, and M48 tanks, all mounting variants of the 90mm gun or its successors, descended directly from lessons learned at Aberdeen in May of 1943. The story of the Aberdeen tests also illuminates a broader truth about World War II's technological and industrial competition. Germany had pioneered heavy tank designs, creating vehicles like the Tiger and King Tiger that were, ton for ton, probably the most powerful tanks fielded by any nation during the war. But Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce these vehicles in numbers sufficient to decisively affect outcomes. Fewer than 1,500 Tigers were built during the entire war. Fewer than 500 King Tigers reached frontline units. These were extraordinary machines, but they were too few. America, by contrast, produced more than 49,000 Sherman tanks, supplemented by thousands of tank destroyers, hundreds of Pershings, and vast numbers of support vehicles. When American ordnance discovered that the Sherman's gun was inadequate against Tigers, American industry responded by producing better guns and mounting them on available chassis. The M36 tank destroyer was essentially a Sherman hull with a new turret and the 90mm gun, a pragmatic solution that could be implemented quickly without redesigning the entire vehicle from scratch. This industrial flexibility was something Germany simply could not match by 1943 and 1944. German factories were under constant aerial bombardment. Raw materials were scarce. Transportation networks were degraded. Even when German engineers designed superior weapons, and in many cases they did, getting those weapons to frontline units in meaningful numbers proved increasingly impossible. The Aberdeen tests, then, represented not just a technical validation of American gun design, but a demonstration of American industrial problem-solving. When faced with a superior enemy tank, the American response was not to panic or accept inferiority, but to test methodically, identify solutions, and implement those solutions as rapidly as production capacity allowed. By mid-1944, less than 14 months after the Aberdeen tests, 36 tank destroyers were engaging Tigers in Europe. The cycle from problem identification to fielded solution had taken barely more than a year. There is a footnote to this story that deserves mention. The Tiger tank tested at Aberdeen in May of 1943 still exists. After the tests concluded, the vehicle was placed on outdoor display at Aberdeen, where it remained for more than 4 decades, slowly deteriorating from weather exposure. In the 1980s, it was moved to the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum, and in the 2000s, when that museum closed, the Tiger was transferred to Fort Benning, Georgia. The tank's armor still bears the scars of the 1943 tests. Multiple impact craters where 90mm rounds struck, several clean penetrations, and the characteristic damage patterns that ordnance engineers use to study armor failure mechanisms. It serves as a physical reminder of the moment when American tank guns caught up with German heavy armor, not in terms of battlefield mythology or propaganda claims, but in measurable, empirical fact. For the men who fought in M36 tank destroyers and M26 Pershing tanks, the Aberdeen tests represented something even more fundamental. They represented the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had cared enough to find out the truth. American industry had not simply accepted that Tigers were invincible. American engineers had captured an enemy tank, brought it to a testing ground, and systematically determined how to defeat it. They had translated that knowledge into better weapons and had put those weapons in the hands of combat crews. This mattered because tank warfare is fundamentally about confidence. The confidence to advance under fire, to engage superior numbers, to make split-second decisions that might mean the difference between survival and death. When American crews buttoned up their hatches and drove toward German positions in late 1944, they did so knowing that their 90mm guns could penetrate Tiger frontal armor at combat ranges. They knew because engineers at Aberdeen had proven it, shot by shot, at measured distances, under controlled conditions. The Tiger had been tested, and the Tiger had failed. That simple fact, prosaic, technical, documented in classified reports and engineering specifications, had rippled outward to affect the consciousness of thousands of American tankers and tank destroyer crews. It had informed tactical doctrine, influenced industrial production priorities, and shaped the final year of armored combat in Europe. A dozen rounds fired at a captured tank on a Maryland testing range in spring of 1943 had, in their way, altered the trajectory of the war. The mythology of the Tiger never entirely disappeared. Even today, 70 years after the last Tigers fell silent, the vehicle retains an aura of menace and dark charisma. It appears in films, video games, and historical documentaries as the epitome of German armored power. This is not entirely undeserved. The Tiger was, by the standards of 1942 and 1943, an extraordinarily powerful tank. But the Aberdeen tests revealed something that mythology obscures. Engineering and industry ultimately matter more than individual excellence. A Tiger could destroy multiple Shermans in a single engagement, but if America could replace those Shermans faster than Germany could build Tigers, the arithmetic favored America. And if American engineers could design a gun that negated the Tiger's armor advantage while mounting it on readily available chassis, the arithmetic favored America even more decisively. The morning of May 17, 1943, had begun with a question. Could American guns defeat German heavy armor? By afternoon, the answer was clear. The 90mm gun could penetrate Tiger frontal armor at ranges where tank combat actually occurred. The Tiger was dangerous, but it was not invincible. It could be killed. This was the secret that the Aberdeen tests revealed. Not some exotic weak spot or hidden vulnerability, but simply the truth that sufficient kinetic energy, properly applied, would defeat any armor. The Tiger's 100mm frontal plate, impressive though it was, obeyed the same laws of physics as any other steel armor. When struck by a 24-pound projectile traveling at 2,650 feet per second, it failed. The hole in the armor did not know that it was puncturing Germany's most feared tank. It was simply a hole, drilled through steel by energy and impact. For the American tank crews who would fight through France, Belgium, and Germany in the final year of the war, this knowledge made all the difference. They were not invincible. They were not even equal, tank for tank, to their German opponents. But they were no longer helpless. They had weapons that could hurt Tigers. And sometimes, in the intimate geometry of tank combat, that was enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.